Share via email. Report story. Buy orchid for hire. Frigid air wiggled like worms into the gaps of Izuku's patchwork ghost costume to nip at his skin, making it burn. No matter how many times he readjusted the fraying sheet around him, it seemed like there was always some new crevice for the chill to creep through. In retrospect, he probably should have slipped his sweater on before venturing out of the apartment instead of stowing it in his backpack for later. Or, really, he shouldn't have been standing out here at all, shivering on the curb in front of the complex he and his mom called home. But letting the cold get to him meant letting his friends down, and Izuku wasn't about to do that, no matter how much he wished they were spending their Halloween playing games and eating candy instead. Another chilly breeze swept by, and Izuku's legs quivered, though. Not just from the cold he couldn't help but fiddle with the straps of his backpack as thoughts of what awaited him and his friends consumed his mind. Trick-or-treating with Uraraka, Iida, and Todoroki, and then a sleepover at Iida's house. Or, at least, those had been his plans for Halloween night until Kachan and his friends had gotten involved. And those had been the details Izuku had shared with his mom. He didn't think she would have let him leave the apartment had he told her what he and his friends were really going to get up to tonight. Never before had he lied to her to such an extent. When he returned home in the morning, he'd probably burst into tears and confess his sins like a man condemned. But that was tomorrow, a concept he'd face only if he survived tonight. From beyond the cluster of trees at the corner of the block came a wiry squeal. To someone else, the sound might have been eerie, especially on Halloween night. But Izuku knew exactly what the sound signified, and it made him feel a tad warmer in the cold night. Uraraka's grin shone nearly as bright as the full moon in the sky above them as she rounded the corner on her worn, creaky bike and caught sight of him standing on the curb. Deku. The soles of her shoes scuffed against the pavement as she used her feet to skid to a stop in front of him. Her irises sparkled as she took him in with wide eyes. Wow, you even put together a ghost costume for the occasion. Izuku stiffly fiddled with the bow tie he'd used to secure the patched, cream sheet around his body and over his head like a hood. If my mom had seen me leave the apartment without a costume when I was supposed to be going trick-or-treating, she would have asked me about it, and then I would have had to lie to her again, and I swear on my life that if I have to lie my mom one more time I'll. Deku. Uraraka cut him off with a raised hand and a giggle, her voice breathy as she laughed. You don't need to explain yourself. I was just giving you a compliment. You look great. In the cold night, Izuku's cheeks burned. He couldn't help but physically curl into himself like a turtle into its shell as he felt his insides go mushy. His voice came out in a whisper. Thanks, Uraraka. She only hummed warmly in response, her smile wide and eyes scrunched tightly shut. Izuku lightly cleared his throat, his brain finally processing that Uraraka was the only one of his friends present. Where's Iida? You know him. She shrugged lightly, one of her thumbs mindlessly tucking into the strap of her overalls and fiddling with the buckle. He's a stickler for the rules. Promoted stories. You'll also like. Hurt cuz I love you to death Izuocha. Ha. 8.6k 141 Class 1A is now Class 2A and is working to be better heroes due to events that had happened before. Deku has gotten strong feelings toward Uraraka during the summer as the hero who sings with a smile 37.5k 361 high. Guys, this is my first story I write on Wattpad. I hope you like it. Finished. 8.2k 508 tilde. He save all of them just a smile plastered on his face before disappearing through the wind. Feelings. Izawa. X-Reader 57K 1.3 KRE posting. This intel I edited, sorry if it's not good, it's my first time writing a story. You enroll at UA and you have multiple quirks you are really good at using, why? Free. Onishots 149K3K. This is a collections of free X readers. Requests on this are now closed. Not all heroes wear capes. Some just have 8.42.2K 1.4 kilo. Everybody. This is a suicidal, depressed Deku book with Dadmic. Will their bond grow? Will Mike fuck up? Will Izuku try to kill himself? Find out yourself. Number 1 Radio. I am. Sequel of UR check mark 69.4K 1.8K. This book is the sequel of You Are So Better. Read that first before going here. Tears of joy, tears of joy. Thank you to that one reader that suggested this title. I can't see you sad face, but thank you. Dread took root in the pit of Izuku's stomach. Quote and Todoroki. Uraraka gave him a small, pity-filled smile as she dropped the next bomb, obviously having picked up on his growing anxiety. He couldn't get his dad to approve of him staying out overnight this time. Izuku's chest thrummed with budding panic. Just 3 days ago, hadn't those two sworn that they'd accompany Izuku to whatever fate was waiting for him at their destination? Izuku clung to his last hope. Quote is Asui coming with us, at least? Nope. With a sigh, Uraraka slid her backpack from her shoulders and tossed it into the wire basket he and Ida had helped her install in front of her bike's handles over the summer. She got stuck taking her little brother and sister around the neighborhood, just like she thought might happen. With his breath slowly puffing out of his mouth into the crisp night air in little clouds, Izuku blankly stared at the brunette as the situation sank in. So it's just us. Just us, Uraraka hummed in affirmation with a nod, her cheeks puffing up as she gave him a small grin of assurance. Izuku swallowed. It wasn't that he didn't want to spend time with Uraraka. That was absolutely not the case, and it never would be, because she was his best friend and he always enjoyed the time he spent by her side. But now, it was just the two of them, when they were originally supposed to be taking this on as a pack of 4. It was just the two of them, and they were going into A. You gonna get on? Izuku jolted. Uraraka was staring at him with one of her brows curiously quirked, a bit of an amused grin beginning to bubble onto her lips. She didn't have to say a word for him to know what was running through her head. They'd been through this routine plenty of times. Izuku knew that slipping her backpack off had been an invitation to climb on behind her. Izuku sprung into motion, not leaving a single second more for hesitation. Fitting both of them on Uraraka's bike had been awkward when they'd first tried it a few years ago. But now they had the positions down to an exact science, with Uraraka scooting as far forward on the seat as she dared and Izuku settling on the thin, flat bar that ran over the back wheel. As Izuku lifted his feet from the road and notched them on top of the protruding bolt in the center of the rear wheel, the familiarity of the position almost immediately eased his nerves. Though wrapping his arms around Uraraka's middle always sparked a nervous tingle in his chest, instead of adding to his jitters, being so close to her ebbed away at the colder, heavier tension that had been plaguing him all day. As she began to pedal down the road, a different feeling began to flood Izuku's veins. Instead of freaking out that it was just the two of them, he was grateful that Uraraka was coming with him at all. On the way to their destination, they passed a cardboard robot, 2 Princess Leias, a pair of giggling witches, a zombified Michael Jackson, and a gaggle of various superheroes containing 3 Supermans. The costumed children became sparser and sparser until they were all alone on the road, zooming along on Uraraka's bike. Spookified houses gave way to birches and pines, and the synths and bass chords from parties were taken over by the rustling of leaves in the wind and the chirping of crickets. The sheet of Izuku's cloak billowed out behind them as they plunged down the steep slope that would take them to their destination. Bakugo and his friends were already there, waiting for them. About damn time, Bakugo growled as Uraraka's brakes screeched and brought them to a shittery stop. A scowl crinkled the blonde's features as he shoved himself off of the rotting fence he'd been leaning against. Of course you two losers were the only ones to show up. Though he was still in the process of dismounting Uraraka's bike, Izuku didn't miss the way his best friend stuck her tongue out at the blonde. Nice costume, Midoriya. Ashido chirped. Once he was on his feet, Izuku awkwardly and shyly fiddled with his bow tie again. He was surprised Kachan hadn't made fun of him for dressing up, though it was probably because all of Bakugo's friends were dressed up, too. Kaminari was sporting some sort of punk rocker look, while Siro was wearing a maskless Spider-Man jumpsuit. Kirishima, meanwhile, was wrapped up in some dirty, fraying bandages, and Mina's pink hair was finessed with a pair of horns on a headband and some uncomfortable-looking sclera lenses. Well, you guys know the deal, Kirishima huffed with a teasing grin. If you can last all night in there, he drew the word out, gesturing with his head to the structure behind him. We'll take over your classroom cleaning responsibilities for the whole month of November. The reward of no cleaning duties for a month wasn't the only reason they were here. Izuku wouldn't have even considered showing up for such a small price, especially when he actually didn't really loathe cleaning duty specifically when Uraraka was his partner. This whole thing had spawned from an occurrence which was rather common. Bakugo calling Izuku a wimp, completely unprovoked. This time around, Uraraka had gotten a little more fired up in coming to Izuku's defense than usual. Eventually, her and Bakugo's bickering in the back of the classroom had drawn Iida's attention, and, of course, Iida getting involved had drawn everyone's attention. Kirishima had done his best to put a stop to Bakugo's jeering and turn it into an opportunity for Izuku to prove himself, but then Ashido and Kaminari had taken things a little bit further than Kirishima had probably intended. The whole ordeal had resulted in a somewhat good-natured bet that was really much more terrifying a prospect than Izuku had initially thought. In exchange for a month off of classroom cleaning duties, Izuku and Uraraka would have to spend all night at the Dahlia House, the most haunted site for miles around. The building stood before them now, shrouded by dead trees and vines and covered in all sorts of grime. The house had very obviously sat vacant for decades, to living occupants, at least. Izuku swallowed again, his eyes never leaving the imposing brick building. Uraraka, I don't know about this. We'll be fine, she assured, plucking her backpack from the basket before propping her bike up against the fence next to their classmates. I don't know, Uraraka, Kaminari teased with a taunting tremble in his voice. You've heard the rumors, all those bodies they found in the cellar after the owner died all those years ago. Siro wiggled his fingers menacingly, using his height to tower over Izuku and Uraraka as he jeered. Word has it the ghosts of the victims still linger, preying on little teenagers. Come off it, you guys, Uraraka rolled her eyes, shoving Siro away with a hand to his chest. She confidently placed her hands on her hips as she stared their classmates down. After working in retail over the summer, I can't imagine dealing with ghosts as too much more of a hassle. Her remark earned her a good-natured snort from Ashido and Kirishima and an eye roll from Bakugo. Uraraka didn't leave room for any more jests. This whole thing had spawned from her attempt to put a stop to some teasing, after all, so it was no surprise that she snatched Izuku's wrist before anyone had the time to say anything more. Come on, Deku, she directed, dragging him through the front gate of the fence before he had a chance to even think about resisting. All he could do was sputter, "Wait, Uraraka." Her grip tightened on his wrist, and when she turned back to give him a smile, it was like the sun itself was beaming just for him. "We'll be fine, Deku. I won't let anything happen to us, all right?" Izuku could only stare back quietly. Despite his fears, when Uraraka looked at him like that, he couldn't help but believe her. Izuku had been half hoping that the local law enforcement had learned their lesson and sealed the entrances to the old building off. But instead, Uraraka had been able to swing the front door open without a hitch. And now, here, they were. A shower of dust rained down from the ceiling as Uraraka tugged the front door shut behind them. They stood side by side as they got their first look at the inside of the house that had been at the center of their childhood horror stories. The walls were covered in dust, soot, and an untold number of other sorts of grime. What might have once been a dining area stood to their left, though all that was left of it was a table with two collapsed legs. A long hallway stretched out before them, running parallel to a staircase that looked about ready to fall apart. Everything that lay beyond the long hallway and staircase was a secret, and Izuku was perfectly content to let the rest of the house remain a mystery. Uraraka, though, had other ideas. She lightly cleared her throat before she turned to him with a hum. "So, do you want to look around a bit? If we're gonna be stuck in here all night, it might help pass the time." Izuku's eyes went wide as his gaze whipped to her. Despite the intensity of his expression, his voice was rather meek as he stuttered, I'm good." Uraraka let out a breathy giggle, bouncing on her feet once before she lightly huffed, "Really, Deku? We're gonna be fine." Izuku hurriedly shook his head, his gaze falling to the floor. I'm not." Uraraka waited patiently for him to finish. He took a deep breath, squeezing his eyes tightly shut to brace himself against his own exclamation. "I'm not brave enough." Uraraka regarded him quietly for a moment. Though Izuku could feel the weight of her gaze upon him, it held no judgment. It was just the gentle gaze of a friend, filled with a million silent ponderings as she sought to understand him. With her thumbs tucked into the straps of her backpack, she whispered, somewhat to herself, "You believe in ghosts, but you really don't believe in yourself, do you?" Izuku stood stock still, his eyes still squeezed tightly shut. She was right. He believed in ghosts, and he'd even managed to believe in Santa Claus for 10 years. But when it came to himself, he couldn't scrounge up enough faith to last even 10 minutes. He was pathetic. Uraraka must have picked up on the subtle drooping of his shoulders. She grabbed his wrist again, though more gently this time in an attempt to coax his gaze to meet hers. "I'm sorry, Deku. I didn't mean anything by it, it was just an observation." Her fingers skimmed across his skin as she shifted her grip to encompass his hand instead of his wrist, "and it doesn't make me like you any less." A burn spread across Izuku's cheeks once more. His wide eyes slowly traversed from where their hands were interlaced to her face, finding that she was smiling that same beaming smile again. He knew she hadn't meant like, as in like, but still, how could she just say stuff like that so casually? Oblivious to his internal meltdown, she continued on with a thoughtful hum. "We all have our things that we're afraid of, right? You're afraid of ghosts. I'm afraid of bugs. Sue hates clowns. Todoroki's terrified of getting peanut butter stuck to the roof of his mouth, for some reason." She actually managed to get a chuckle out of him with that. Uraraka laughed with him, still smiling brightly. But that's what friends are for, right? To help each other overcome all that stuff. You always take the bugs outside for me whenever one gets into my apartment. Iida was there to stop Sue from decking that clown in the face last year at the carnival. And if Todoroki ever gets peanut butter stuck to the roof of his mouth, you better bet that we'll all be there with a spoon to help him out. Izuku laughed again at the image of Uraraka prying Todoroki's mouth open with a spoon. She readjusted her grip on his hand, connecting their palms more firmly. I'm here for you now, too. I won't let any ghosts lay a finger on you. His insides went mushy again. To keep himself from melting into a puddle, he gripped her hand back just as tightly. His cheeks were still burning, but it helped him to fight off the chill of the air and made him feel warm in the best way possible. Though he knew he'd never be able to match her luster, he smiled back as brightly as he could. Thanks, Uraraka. There we go. She gushed, bouncing on her feet again. It's better when you smile. Izuku had thought it was impossible for his blush to get any stronger, but it felt like his cheeks were scorching now. Maybe he really was going to melt into a puddle on the floor. He really didn't deserve a best friend like Uraraka. Izuku eventually agreed to take a look around the rest of the home. Uraraka had waited a few hours before gently asking again, after they'd worked their way through a couple bags of Izuku's homemade trail mix and played a few games with the deck of cards Uraraka had brought along. While Izuku was undoubtedly still terrified of running into any ghosts, he couldn't deny the logical side of his brain. They'd been in the house for a few hours now, and nothing out of the ordinary had happened. He'd even found that the atmosphere had grown somewhat comfortable, though that was likely largely due to the fact that Uraraka was here with him. Ever the saintly saint that she was, Uraraka had offered to lead the charge. He could tell that she was walking extra slow for his sake. She was constantly turning back to look at him, too, a warm smile on her face as she checked to make sure he was okay. They'd made their way to the second floor now, and thus far, the scariest thing they'd experienced was the rotting 10th step of the staircase. There were no ghosts. There were no mysterious noises or objects that moved on their own. There weren't even any creepy paintings or marks on the walls. At the end of it all, the house really wasn't that scary or ghostly. A creak and a giggle echoed from somewhere else in the house. Izuku froze. Scratch that. All of his fears and anxieties clawed into him again at full force. Uraraka. He called out nervously to the girl in front of him, fear crawling up his throat. Did you hear something? Uraraka spun to him with a question on her lips. But she never got the chance to voice it. Izuku swore his heart stopped when a pair of arms reached out from the black void of the open doorway to her right. Uraraka. He gasped. Fingers dug into her, one hand curling around the loop at the top of her backpack while the other fisted in the sleeve of her sweatshirt. She screamed as they latched on, and just as her wide eyes found his, she was yanked back into the darkness. Uraraka. He tried to run after her, but found himself lurching back instead, his own clothes choking him. He whipped around to find that the long sheet of his ghost costume had gotten caught on an upturned splinter of the wooden flooring. Before he could even begin his fight to free himself, a door slammed shut behind him. Dread clenched his throat like a vice. A panicked glance over his shoulder confirmed his fears. It was the door to the room that Uraraka had gotten dragged into that had slammed shut. They really weren't alone in the house after all, and the sudden coldness of the hallway had only one thought creeping into Izuku's head: ghost. Damn it. He hissed, finally managing to yank himself free, though he ripped his sheet in the process. But he didn't give a damn. He immediately stumbled to the door that kept him from his best friend, pounding against it with a shout, "Uraraka!" The door was locked. Of course, it was locked. Uraraka screamed one more time on the other side, though her cry was muffled by more than just the door. Izuku's eyes burned at the fear in her voice. What was happening to her? He slammed his shoulder against the door again and again, praying that either the wood or the lock would give. But it didn't. The door only stubbornly rattled in its frame with every impact of his shoulder. For a house as old as this, why on earth was this door so strong? The rest of the wood, including the floor, seemed ready to snap. So why was this door of all the doors in the house still so strong? Uraraka's screaming had turned into stifled yelling, and a frigid pit of horror bloomed in his chest when a muffled chorus of voices answered her. Izuku's mind was flooded with all of the horror stories he'd heard about this place, from the reclusive owner to the pile of bodies in the cellar. Every child knew the tale. The vengeful ghosts of the victims still lingered, mercilessly inflicting horror and death upon all those who dared to enter the place of their demise. The tears finally escaped Izuku's eyes at the thought of Uraraka in their midst. But he didn't stop trying to break down the door. He wouldn't let her succumb to that fate. She'd promised to be there for him, and he'd be damned if he wasn't there for her, too. On what had to be at least the 12th slam of his shoulder against the door, the old, rusty lock finally gave. His momentum sent him flying into the room, but he was ready for it, his fists clenched. Uraraka. His determination jolted like a record scratch, his feet stumbling to a stop when he found Uraraka on the floor, collapsed on top of a moaning Kaminari. Izuku's brows furrowed even further when he noticed the way Kaminari was clutching at his cheek. Uraraka didn't seem to even notice Izuku had charged into the room. Her back was to him as she shoved herself off of their classmate, her cheeks indignantly puffed. "That's what you get for grabbing me out of nowhere like that." "Yeah, dude." Izuku's gaze shot to find the owner of the sharp huff. Hiroshima was halfway across the room, heading towards Uraraka with the obvious intent of helping her up. His brows were pinched in disappointment. "You were just supposed to give her a little nudge, not yank her soul out of her body." Izuku was still frozen, wondering what on earth he'd stumbled into. "Bakugo and Shiro were the ones that told me to do it." Kaminari slurred past his already swelling cheek, pointing an accusing finger at the pair in question. Izuku's gaze followed Kaminari's finger, finding Bakugo, Shiro, and Mina all perched around the room's open window. It was only when he made eye contact with one of them that someone seemed to finally realize he'd charged into the room. Ashido took in an excited breath, pressing her palms to her cheeks and looking like she'd ascended as she squealed, "Ah, you guys." Midoriya came charging in after her. "Come on." Bakugo growled as he shoved himself off of the wall. He was obviously disappointed as he charged towards Izuku and screeched, "Where are the tears?" Still frozen in his "come at me" ghost's pose, Izuku looked between his classmates slowly. Finally, his focus found Uraraka again. She was facing him now, her eyes wide as she took in the sight of him standing there, ready for battle. As he made eye contact with her, everything finally began to process in his mind. Izuku's clenched fists fell back to his sides slowly. "So there's no ghosts." "No ghosts," Hiroshima confirmed with a sigh. His lips pressed into a thin line as he stared at his moaning blonde friend. "Just a few idiots. Fucking waste of a night," Bakugo suddenly hissed, brushing past Izuku without even casting him a glance. Izuku blankly stared after his childhood frenemy as he charged out the busted door and down the hall. He jumped a little when Ashido suddenly clapped a hand on his shoulder. Sorry for pranking ya, Midoriya. No hard feelings though, right? Oh, no. Izuku muttered, still a little caught up in the whirlwind that had been the last few minutes. Of course not. Right on, she chirped, shooting him with little finger guns as she skipped out the door backwards to follow after Bakugo. I'm sorry, too, you guys. Zero called out over his shoulder as he stumbled out of the room with Kaminari's arm over his neck. Izuku thought Kaminari might have sputtered out an apology, too, but he couldn't be sure. He turned back around to find that Kirishima and Uraraka had finally made it to their feet. As Uraraka started batting away the dust and dirt clinging to her overalls, Kirishima gave them both a little bow with his hands pressed together in front of his chest. As promised, we'll take over your guys' cleaning duties for the next month. Izuku shook his head, but it's not morning yet. Midoriya. Kirishima cut him off with a grin. Come on, we owe it to you guys after that scare we gave you. I'll make sure Bakugo does his part, too. But, Kirishima interrupted him again. Izuku let out a little sigh. Fine. Good. Kirishima extolled, practically bouncing on his feet as he ran to the door. He caught himself on the frame, shouting back at them, and no take-backs. He disappeared down the hall after his friends, leaving Izuku and Uraraka on their own again, standing side by side in the middle of the room. Well, Izuku cleared his throat before turning to Uraraka with a little grin. I guess we can leave. Why yeah, she mumbled, her gaze downturned. Izuku's brows furrowed at the little hitch in her breath. Uraraka, are you okay? Had she gotten hurt in her little tumble with Kaminari earlier? I'm fine, she breathed, her gaze still glued to the floor. She lifted her right hand, shaking it out. My hand hurts a little from punching Kaminari though. His hands found her wrist on instinct, gently bringing her hand closer to his face so he could get a better look at it. Her knuckles were definitely a little red, and her fingers looked a little stiff. He'd have to take her back to his place and wrap her hand for her before sending her back to her own apartment, even though that meant telling his mom the truth about where they'd been. We should definitely get this wrapped before. The rest of his sentence got lodged in his throat when he lifted his gaze to her face. Uraraka's cheeks were bright red, and her brown eyes were blown wide. Izuku's own eyes went wide when his brain finally caught up with his actions. His hands jolted away from her skin, but before he could get even a single syllable of an apology out, she was jumping into her own sentiments. I just wanted to say. I knew it, she affirmed, glancing at him shyly as she gently held the wrist he'd been holding not even 10 seconds prior. You were brave enough. Izuku stared at her in silence for a few moments before he blurted, What? Earlier, you said that you weren't brave enough to face down a bunch of ghosts. She pressed the tips of her fingers together shyly. But you came charging in after me like a hero. So, you really should believe in yourself more. Izuku didn't even get the time to process all of that. She was right next to him the next instant, her hands on his arm to steady herself as she pressed up onto the balls of her feet. Her lips gently pressed against his cheek, her next words whispered right next to his ear, Thanks, Deku. For coming after me. Izuku was still as a statue as she ripped away from him, her hands clutched tightly over her blazing cheeks as she ran from the room, chastising herself all the while. Why did I do that? Izuku's fingers numbly came to rest where her lips had pressed against his cheek, his skin slowly heating once more. His brain wasn't really working at the moment, and when it finally kicked back into gear in a few minutes, his soul would probably leave his body right on the spot. But, in the moment, he felt pretty damn good. Uraraka was right. If he could believe in ghosts, Then, maybe he could believe in himself, too. Where stories live. Discover now.